On the evening of October 15th, 2023, Marcus Washington was walking home from his local coffee shop in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. At 34 years old, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the world and survived its darkest corners. His bronze star pin gleamed subtly on his navy blazer, a small reminder of valor that most people never noticed and fewer still understood. Marcus had just finished reviewing security protocols for a major downtown corporation where he worked as a senior consultant. His military background made him invaluable in a post-9/11 world where corporate security wasn't just about checking badges. It was about understanding real threats, reading situations, and making split-second decisions that could save lives. Skills he'd learned in the mountains of Afghanistan were now keeping Chicago's business district safe. But as Marcus turned onto his quiet residential street that Tuesday evening, none of his training could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. 3 police cars suddenly surrounded him, their flashing red and blue lights cutting through the October darkness like strobes at a nightmare. 6 officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Get on the ground. Now, hands where we can see them." Marcus felt his military training kick in, assess the threat, remain calm, follow orders to de-escalate. He slowly raised his hands, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Officers, I'm unarmed. I live right here on this block. My name is Marcus Washington, and I'm a veteran." But the lead officer, a man named Detective Ray Morrison who had been on the force for 8 years, wasn't interested in conversation. "I don't care if you're the president. You match the description of an armed robbery suspect. Get down." As Marcus knelt on the cold asphalt of his own neighborhood street, his bronze star pin catching the harsh glare of the police lights, he couldn't help but think about the irony. Here he was, a man who had charged into Taliban strongholds to save wounded American soldiers, now being treated like a common criminal on American soil. The same hands that had pulled 3 Marines to safety under enemy fire were now being zip-tied behind his back. What the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the man they were arresting had a military record that read like something out of an action movie. Marcus Washington wasn't just any veteran. He was a decorated Special Operations Forces soldier who had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and received the Bronze Star for conspicuous gallantry in action against an armed enemy. But in that moment, under those flashing lights, with neighbors' phones recording from windows and doorways, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it. This is the story of how one night of injustice would ultimately expose a truth so powerful that it would change not just Marcus's life, but the entire conversation about how America treats its heroes. To understand the full weight of what happened that October evening, we need to go back to the beginning. Marcus Washington grew up in Chicago's South Side, in a neighborhood where military service was both a family tradition and a pathway to a better life. His grandfather had served in Korea, his father in Vietnam, and when Marcus graduated high school in 2007, there was never any question about what came next. But Marcus didn't just join the military. He excelled in ways that defied every stereotype about young black men from his neighborhood. After basic training, he was selected for the Special Operations Forces, an elite unit that represents less than 3% of the entire U.S. military. The selection process alone eliminated 90% of candidates, but Marcus's combination of physical prowess, tactical intelligence, and unshakable composure under pressure made him exactly what the Army was looking for. His first deployment to Afghanistan in 2011 was a baptism by fire. Marcus found himself in the Kunar province, one of the most dangerous regions in the country, where Taliban fighters knew every mountain path and cave system. It was here that Marcus first demonstrated the courage that would define his military career. During a routine patrol that turned into an hours-long firefight, Marcus single-handedly held off enemy forces while evacuating 3 wounded soldiers to safety. The Bronze Star citation would later read, "Sergeant Washington's extraordinary heroism and selfless service in the face of grave danger reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. But the Army wasn't done with Marcus Washington. His second deployment in 2014 took him to Helmand Province, where he served as a team leader in some of the most classified operations of the entire Afghan campaign. The details of many of his missions remain redacted to this day, but military records show that Marcus was involved in high-value target operations that disrupted major Taliban supply lines and saved countless coalition lives. It was during his third and final deployment in 2016 that Marcus sustained the injuries that would earn him the Purple Heart. An improvised explosive device detonated near his convoy, killing 2 soldiers and severely injuring 5 others. Despite suffering shrapnel wounds to his back and legs, Marcus organized the defense of the convoy and coordinated the medical evacuation that saved every surviving member of his unit. His commanding officer later wrote, "In my 23 years of military service, I have never witnessed such a display of leadership under fire." When Marcus returned home to Chicago in 2017, he carried with him not just physical scars, but the invisible wounds that come with years of combat. Like many veterans, he struggled with the transition to civilian life. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in Afghanistan made everyday situations feel threatening. The camaraderie and sense of purpose that defined military life was replaced by the isolating reality of a society that seemed to have forgotten there was still a war going on. But Marcus was determined to build a meaningful civilian career. Using his GI Bill benefits, he earned a degree in criminal justice and homeland security. His combination of real-world combat experience and academic training made him incredibly valuable in the private security sector. By 2020, he was working as a senior consultant for Blackstone Security Solutions, one of Chicago's most prestigious corporate security firms. Marcus's client list read like a who's who of Chicago business. He designed security protocols for major law firms, financial institutions, and corporate headquarters. His military background gave him insights that desk-bound security professionals simply couldn't match. He understood how real threats developed, how to spot suspicious behavior, and how to coordinate with law enforcement in crisis situations. His reputation was impeccable, his client testimonials glowing. But despite his professional success, Marcus couldn't escape the reality of being a black man in America. Time and time again, he found himself in situations where his expertise was questioned, his credentials doubted, his presence viewed with suspicion. At client meetings in downtown office buildings, security guards would often stop him, assuming he was a delivery person or maintenance worker rather than the consultant they were expecting. When he arrived at high-end corporate events, other attendees would sometimes hand him their coats, assuming he worked for the catering company. These incidents were humiliating, but Marcus had learned to navigate them with grace. He would calmly present his credentials, maintain his professional demeanor, and focus on doing exceptional work that spoke for itself. His military training had taught him that the mission was always more important than personal pride. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he could be trusted to design security systems protecting millions of dollars in assets and hundreds of corporate employees, but couldn't walk through his own neighborhood without being viewed as a threat. The same tactical awareness that made him invaluable to his clients made some people uncomfortable when they saw a large black man who seemed to be paying too much attention to his surroundings. Marcus had learned to code switch constantly, adjusting his posture, his voice, his entire presence depending on the situation. In boardrooms, he was the polished professional. In his neighborhood, he was the friendly neighbor who helped elderly residents with their groceries. With other veterans, he could let his guard down and speak the language of shared experience. But nowhere could he simply be himself without consideration for how others might perceive him. The events of October 15th, 2023, began earlier that day when Marcus finished a consulting session with a major downtown law firm. He had spent the afternoon reviewing their emergency evacuation procedures and updating their threat assessment protocols. It was detailed, technical work that required years of experience to do properly, and the firm's partners had been impressed with his recommendations. After wrapping up the meeting, Marcus stopped at his favorite coffee shop, a a small black-owned business called Veterans Brew that had become a gathering place for military veterans in the neighborhood. The owner, a Navy veteran named Sarah Collins, always made sure Marcus's usual order, a large black coffee and a blueberry muffin, was ready when he walked in. "How's business, Marcus?" Sarah asked as she handed him his coffee. "Can't complain," Marcus replied. "Just finished up a big project downtown. Feels good to use the training for something positive, you know?" It was this kind of casual conversation that Marcus treasured. Sarah understood the unique challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. She didn't see his success as surprising or his presence as threatening. She saw him as exactly what he was, a veteran who had served his country with honor and was now building a meaningful civilian career. As Marcus walked home that evening, he felt content. The October air was crisp but not cold, the kind of weather that reminded him why he loved Chicago despite everything. He was thinking about weekend plans and looking forward to a quiet evening at home when the police cars appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The arrest happened so quickly that neighbors barely had time to understand what they were witnessing. One moment, Marcus Washington was walking peacefully down his own street. The next, he was face down on the asphalt with 6 police officers surrounding him, their weapons drawn and voices raised in commands that seemed to multiply and contradict each other. "Stay down. Don't move. Roll over. Show us your hands." He's reaching for something, but Marcus wasn't reaching for anything. His military training had kicked in the moment he saw the police cars, and every instinct told him to follow orders, remain calm, and de-escalate the situation. Even as zip ties cut into his wrists and gravel pressed into his cheek, Marcus maintained the composure that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. "Officers," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "My name is Marcus Washington. I live at 847 South Prairie Avenue, apartment 3B. I'm a veteran of the United States Army, and I'm unarmed. I have identification in my wallet, and my military discharge papers are in my apartment if you need verification." Detective Morrison, the lead officer, barely looked at Marcus as he spoke. "Save it for the station," he said, hauling Marcus to his feet with unnecessary force. "We got a call about an armed robbery suspect in this area. You match the description perfectly." What Morrison didn't mention was how general that description had been. Black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. In a neighborhood that was predominantly African American, this description could have fit hundreds of men. But Morrison had made his decision the moment he saw Marcus walking alone after dark. As Marcus was loaded into the back of the police car, neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from Marcus, watched in disbelief. She had known Marcus for 3 years, ever since he had moved into the neighborhood. He was the young man who shoveled her sidewalk in winter without being asked, who carried her groceries up 2 flights of stairs, who had fixed her broken window when her landlord ignored her calls. "That's Marcus," she called out to the officers. "He lives right here. He's a good boy, a veteran. There's been some mistake." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officers were already pulling away, their mission accomplished in their minds. They had a suspect in custody, paperwork to file, and a case to close. The fact that neighbors were vouching for Marcus only confirmed their suspicions. Criminals always had people willing to lie for them. At the 2nd District Police Station, Marcus was processed like any other suspect. His belongings were confiscated, his fingerprints taken, his mugshot captured under harsh fluorescent lights. When the intake officer asked for his occupation, Marcus replied simply, "Security consultant and U.S. Army veteran." The officer barely looked up from his paperwork. "Yeah, and I'm a Navy SEAL," he muttered, checking boxes on forms that would classify Marcus as unemployed. It was during the booking process that the first crack in the narrative began to appear. When Marcus's fingerprints were run through the federal database, something unexpected happened. Instead of the criminal record that officers assumed they would find, the system returned a military service record that made the desk sergeant pause and read twice. "Hey Morrison," the sergeant called across the room. "You need to see this." Detective Morrison walked over, expecting to review a standard criminal history. Instead, he found himself looking at a service record that detailed 3 combat deployments, multiple commendations, and a security clearance level that was higher than his own police authorization. "This has got to be wrong," Morrison said, staring at the screen. "Run it again." But the second search returned the same results. Marcus Washington wasn't just any veteran. He was a decorated Special Operations Forces soldier with a record of service that few people could claim. The Bronze Star citation alone was enough to make any American proud, detailing acts of heroism under fire that had saved multiple lives. Morrison felt the first flutter of doubt in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. Criminal records could be falsified, and veterans weren't immune to committing crimes. The fact that Marcus had military training might actually make him more dangerous, not less. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Marcus sat quietly and began to plan. His military training had taught him that every situation, no matter how dire, had potential solutions. The key was to remain calm, assess available resources, and execute a strategy methodically. Right now, his most valuable resource was time. The longer he remained in custody, the more opportunities there would be for the truth to emerge. Marcus knew that his arrest would trigger several automatic processes. His security clearance required him to report any interactions with law enforcement, which meant his military contacts would be notified. His employer had protocols for employees who missed work without notice, which would lead to questions. Most importantly, his arrest was now part of the public record, which meant it could be discovered by anyone who knew how to look. The first breakthrough came at 11:47 p.m., nearly 4 hours after Marcus's arrest. Officer Janet Williams, a rookie who had joined the force 6 months earlier, was assigned to verify Marcus's identity as part of standard booking procedures. Unlike her more experienced colleagues, Williams actually took the time to read Marcus's military service record carefully. What she found made her breath catch. The man sitting in their holding cell wasn't just a veteran. He was a hero whose actions in Afghanistan had been classified at levels she had never seen before. The Bronze Star citation described acts of valor that belonged in movies, not in their mundane police reports. Williams had grown up in a military family and understood what she was reading in ways her civilian colleagues did not. The terminology, the unit designations, the deployment dates, everything checked out with a precision that couldn't be faked. More importantly, the security clearance levels indicated that Marcus had been trusted with national secrets that were far above her own law enforcement authorization. "Sergeant," Williams called nervously, "I think we might have a problem." By midnight, word of Marcus Washington's arrest had begun to spread through networks that Detective Morrison never could have anticipated. The military operates on a principle of accountability that extends far beyond active duty service. When one of their own is in trouble, especially a decorated veteran, the response is swift and coordinated. The first call came to the 2nd District Station at 12:15 a.m. from Colonel Patricia Hayes, Marcus's former commanding officer who was now stationed at the Pentagon. Hayes had been notified through automatic security clearance monitoring systems that Marcus had been arrested. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Colonel Hayes calling regarding one of my former soldiers, Marcus Washington," she told the desk sergeant. "I understand he's in your custody, and I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately." The desk sergeant, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department named Tom Rodriguez, had dealt with plenty of angry family members and friends over the years. But there was something different about this call. A precision and urgency that suggested this wasn't going to be routine. "Ma'am, visiting hours don't begin until—" "Sergeant," Colonel Hayes interrupted, her voice cutting through his standard response like a blade. "Marcus Washington holds a top-secret security clearance and has been involved in classified operations at the highest levels of national security. His arrest triggers federal notification protocols that supersede local police procedures. I need to speak with your watch commander now." Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. In 20 years on the force, he had never dealt with anything involving national security clearances. He quickly transferred the call to Lieutenant Mike Shannon, the night watch commander who was already having trouble sleeping over the unusual arrest report that had crossed his desk. While Colonel Hayes was demanding answers from police leadership, another network was mobilizing. Marcus's employer, Blackstone Security Solutions, had automated systems that monitored their consultants' legal status. Any arrest or legal issue involving their personnel triggered immediate review, especially for someone with Marcus's clearance level and client access. At 12:30 a.m., James Blackstone himself, the founder and CEO of the company, received an automated alert on his phone. Blackstone was a former FBI agent who had built his company's reputation on employing only the most qualified and trustworthy security professionals. Marcus Washington was one of his top consultants, someone he had personally vouched for with dozens of high-profile clients. Blackstone's first reaction was disbelief. In 3 years of employment, Marcus had never even been late for a meeting, let alone involved in criminal activity. But the automated system was clear. Marcus had been arrested and charged with armed robbery, a felony that would immediately disqualify him from any security work and potentially expose Blackstone's company to massive liability issues. Unable to sleep, Blackstone drove to his office and began reviewing Marcus's employment file. What he found reinforced his initial disbelief. Marcus's background investigation had been more thorough than most FBI agent applications. Military records, financial history, personal references, psychological evaluations, everything had been meticulously verified. The idea that this man had committed armed robbery was not just unlikely, it was virtually impossible. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison was beginning to face questions he wasn't prepared to answer. The armed robbery that had supposedly prompted Marcus's arrest was looking increasingly problematic under scrutiny. The victim, an elderly white woman named Margaret Chun, had reported being robbed at gunpoint by a black man near the Blue Line station. But when pressed for details, her description had been vague and contradictory. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, she had told the responding officers. Dark skin, wearing dark clothes. He had a gun and demanded my purse. The location of the alleged robbery was nearly 2 miles from where Marcus had been arrested. The timing didn't match either. Mrs. Chun reported the robbery at 8:15 p.m., but security cameras from Veterans Brew showed Marcus leaving the coffee shop at 8:45 p.m., a 30-minute gap that would have made it impossible for him to travel between the locations on foot. More problematic was the weapon. Mrs. Chun insisted her attacker had been armed with a handgun, but no weapon had been found on Marcus or anywhere near his arrest location. A thorough search of his apartment, conducted with a warrant that Morrison had rushed through, had turned up no weapons, no stolen property, and no evidence of criminal activity whatsoever. What the search had revealed, however, was a shrine to military service that made even the most cynical officers pause. Marcus's apartment was modest but immaculate, organized with military precision. The walls were covered with commendations, unit photos, and memorabilia from his deployments. His Bronze Star and Purple Heart were displayed in a place of honor, surrounded by letters of recommendation from commanding officers and fellow soldiers. Officer Williams, who had participated in the search, found herself standing in front of Marcus's military display for several minutes. The photos told a story of genuine heroism. Marcus in full combat gear in Afghanistan, Marcus with his unit after successful missions, Marcus receiving his Bronze Star from a general whose name she recognized from news reports. "Serge," Williams called to Morrison, "you need to see this." But Morrison was already feeling defensive about the case and wasn't interested in evidence that contradicted his initial assumptions. "So he's got some military stuff," he said dismissively. "Plenty of criminals are veterans. Doesn't prove anything." By 2 a.m., the situation was escalating beyond Morrison's control. Colonel Hayes had contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office, triggering a federal review of Marcus's arrest. The state's attorney's office was asking pointed questions about the evidence. Internal Affairs had received a complaint from Marcus's employer alleging false arrest and civil rights violations. Most importantly, the media had gotten wind of the story. A local investigative reporter named Maria Santos, who specialized in police misconduct cases, had been monitoring police scanners when she heard about the unusual arrest of a decorated veteran. Santos had spent years building relationships within the veteran community, and it didn't take long for her sources to identify Marcus Washington and provide details about his military service. Santos arrived at the police station at 2:30 a.m. with a cameraman and a list of questions that made Lieutenant Shannon's hands shake. She had already pulled Marcus's public military records, contacted his former commanding officers, and spoken with neighbors who vouched for his character. Her story was going to run on the morning news whether the police cooperated or not. Lieutenant Shannon, Santos said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had broken dozens of major stories. Can you explain why Chicago police arrested a Bronze Star recipient in his own neighborhood based on a robbery description that doesn't match the time, location, or physical evidence? Shannon felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October night. This was exactly the kind of situation that destroyed careers and sparked citywide protests. He could already imagine the headlines. War hero arrested while walking home, Bronze Star recipient brutalized by Chicago police, military veterans' civil rights violated. But the damage was already spreading beyond what any single news story could contain. Social media had discovered the story, and videos from neighbors' phones were being shared thousands of times per hour. The contrast was stark and damning. A decorated war hero on his knees with guns pointed at him for the crime of walking while black in his own neighborhood. The hashtag Justice for Marcus was trending on Twitter by 3 a.m. Veterans organizations across the country were sharing the story and demanding answers. The VFW, American Legion, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America had all issued statements condemning Marcus's treatment and calling for a full investigation. But perhaps the most damaging development was happening inside the police station itself. Other officers were beginning to distance themselves from Morrison's decision. The overnight shift had heard about the military records, seen the evidence problems, and watched the media attention grow. Nobody wanted to be associated with what was increasingly looking like a catastrophic mistake. Officer Rodriguez, the desk sergeant who had taken the first call from Colonel Hayes, finally spoke up at 4 a.m. "Lieutenant," he said to Shannon, "I think we need to cut this guy loose. The evidence doesn't support the charges, and this is turning into a nightmare." But Morrison wasn't ready to back down. Admitting mistake would mean accepting responsibility for false arrest, civil rights violations, and national embarrassment. Instead, he doubled down on his original theory, insisting that Marcus's military training made him more dangerous, not less suspicious. "These special ops guys are trained killers," Morrison argued. "Who knows what kind of PTSD issues he's dealing with? Maybe he snapped and doesn't even remember committing the robbery." It was a desperate theory that satisfied no one and convinced fewer. By dawn, it was clear that Detective Morrison had made one of the most costly mistakes in the history of the 2nd District. The only question now was how much damage had been done and whether it could be contained. Marcus Washington, meanwhile, remained in his holding cell with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the ordeal. He had spent enough time in real danger to know that this situation, however unjust, was temporary. The truth had a way of emerging, especially when enough people were paying attention. What Marcus didn't yet know was that his arrest was about to become a turning point not just in his own life, but in a much larger conversation about how America treats its heroes. At 6:30 a.m. on October 16, 2023, Chicago Police Superintendent David Martinez received a phone call that would change the trajectory of his career. On the other end of the line was General Patricia Nakamura, the highest-ranking military official at the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff, calling about an urgent matter involving one of our nation's most decorated veterans. Superintendent Martinez, General Nakamura's voice carried the weight of decades of military leadership. "I'm calling about Sergeant Marcus Washington, who is currently in the custody of your 2nd District. I need you to understand exactly who you're holding." Martinez, who had been Chicago's top cop for 5 years, felt his stomach drop. He hadn't been briefed on any arrests involving military personnel, which meant his officers had either failed to follow protocol or hadn't understood the significance of what they had done. General Nakamura continued, her words precise and devastating. Marcus Washington led special operations missions that saved over 200 American lives during his service in Afghanistan. He has been personally decorated by 3 different commanding generals and holds security clearances that are higher than most federal judges. The man your officers arrested while he was walking home from a coffee shop is a national hero. As dawn broke over Chicago, the story was exploding across every media platform simultaneously. Maria Santos's morning news report had been picked up by national networks, and by 7 a.m., footage of Marcus's arrest was being broadcast from New York to Los Angeles. The visual was devastating. A decorated war hero on his knees with weapons pointed at him, his bronze star pin visible as police zip-tied his hands behind his back. But the most powerful moment came when Colonel Hayes appeared on CNN's morning show, holding a photograph of Marcus receiving his Bronze Star from a 3-star general. Her voice shook with barely controlled anger as she described Marcus's service record. This young man charged into Taliban strongholds to save wounded American soldiers, Colonel Hayes said, her military bearing evident even through television screens across the country. He has risked his life for this country more times than most people could imagine, and he was arrested for the crime of walking home. While Black in America, the interview went viral within minutes, shared by veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and millions of ordinary Americans who were outraged by what they were seeing. #Justice for Marcus became the #1 trending topic worldwide, with celebrities, politicians, and military leaders adding their voices to the growing chorus of condemnation. Inside the 2nd District Station, chaos reigned. The phones hadn't stopped ringing since 5 a.m., with calls from reporters, veterans organizations, civil rights attorneys, and federal agencies. Lieutenant Shannon had been fielding increasingly hostile questions from the media while desperately trying to figure out how to extricate his department from the worst public relations disaster in its history. At 8:15 a.m., Marcus Washington was finally released from custody, nearly 12 hours after his arrest. The charges were quietly dropped with no explanation, and his personal belongings were returned with mumbled apologies from officers who couldn't meet his eyes. As Marcus walked out of the police station into the bright October morning, he was greeted by a crowd of reporters, veterans, and community supporters who had gathered to witness his release. But Marcus Washington was not the same man who had been arrested the night before. The experience had crystallized something that had been building inside him for years, a recognition that his individual success, his military honors, his professional achievements meant nothing if the system itself remained unchanged. Standing on the steps of the police station, still wearing the same navy blazer and Bronze Star pin from the night before, Marcus delivered impromptu remarks that would be remembered as one of the most powerful speeches about injustice and dignity in recent memory. "Last night, I was arrested for walking home in my own neighborhood," Marcus began, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had commanded respect in combat zones. "I was treated like a criminal despite having spent 3 years of my life fighting for this country in Afghanistan. I was handcuffed and humiliated despite having risked my life to save American soldiers under enemy fire." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word as television cameras captured the moment. "But I want to be clear about something," Marcus continued. "This isn't just about me. This is about every Black veteran who has served this country with honor and returned home to face suspicion instead of respect. This is about every young Black man who can't walk through his own neighborhood without being seen as a threat. This is about a system that needs to change." Marcus paused, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his words across the nation. "I didn't survive Taliban attacks and IEDs in Afghanistan to be treated like an enemy on American soil. And I'm not going to stay quiet about it." The speech went viral immediately, viewed millions of times within hours and shared by everyone from former presidents to active duty service members. veterans from across the country began sharing their own stories of discrimination and profiling, creating a movement that Marcus had never intended to lead but found himself uniquely positioned to represent. Within days, Marcus's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and offers of support from organizations across the country. The NAACP wanted him to speak at their national convention. Veterans organizations invited him to testify before Congress. Civil rights attorneys offered to represent him in what would surely be a massive lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department. But Marcus had learned something about himself during those 12 hours in custody. He realized that his military training had prepared him not just for combat, but for leadership in civilian life. The same qualities that had made him an effective soldier: discipline, strategic thinking, the ability to remain calm under pressure, could be used to create systemic change. Instead of simply accepting settlements and moving on with his life, Marcus made a decision that would transform his arrest from a personal injustice into a catalyst for nationwide reform. He was going to use his platform, his credibility, and his military background to tackle the very issues that had led to his arrest in the first place. The war hero was about to become a different kind of warrior, fighting battles on American soil that were just as important as any he had faced in Afghanistan. 6 months after his arrest, Marcus Washington stood in the rotunda of the Illinois state capitol, surrounded by lawmakers, veterans, and civil rights leaders who had gathered to witness the signing of the Marcus Washington Act, landmark legislation that would fundamentally change how police departments across Illinois interact with military veterans. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. Within weeks of his release, Marcus had established the Veterans Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing discrimination against military veterans and reforming police training practices. His unique combination of military credibility, personal experience with injustice, and natural leadership ability made him a powerful advocate for change. The lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department had been settled for $2.8 million, but Marcus had insisted that the majority of the money go toward establishing training programs rather than personal compensation. This was never about money, he told reporters. This was about making sure no other veteran goes through what I experienced. Detective Ray Morrison, the officer who had orchestrated Marcus's arrest, was facing federal civil rights charges and had been terminated from the Chicago Police Department. The investigation into his conduct had revealed a pattern of discriminatory policing that had affected dozens of black residents over his 8-year career. Morrison's aggressive approach and racial profiling had finally caught up with him, ending his law enforcement career and serving as a warning to other officers who might be tempted to let prejudice guide their decisions. But Marcus's greatest triumph wasn't in the downfall of one corrupt officer. It was in the systemic changes his case had sparked across the country. The Veterans Justice Initiative had partnered with police departments in 12 states to implement new training protocols that specifically addressed the unique needs and contributions of military veterans. Officers were now required to complete coursework on military service, PTSD awareness, and the proper procedures for interacting with veterans during police encounters. The training program, developed with input from military psychologists and veteran advocacy groups, taught officers to recognize signs of military service and to approach veterans with the respect their service deserved. More importantly, it established clear protocols for verifying military credentials and contacting appropriate military liaisons when veterans were involved in police incidents. Marcus had also testified before 3 congressional committees, sharing his story with lawmakers who were crafted federal legislation to address similar issues nationwide. His testimony was compelling not just because of his personal experience, but because of his ability to speak with authority about both military service and civilian law enforcement challenges. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Marcus told the House Veterans Affairs Committee, his bronze star pin gleaming under the committee room lights. I understand the complexities of making split-second decisions under pressure, but I also understand that American citizens, especially veterans who have served their country with honor, deserve better than to be treated as threats in their own neighborhoods. The federal legislation that emerged from these hearings known as the Veterans Dignity Act, established national standards for police interactions with military veterans and created a federal database that would allow law enforcement to quickly verify military service during police encounters. The bill passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, a rare example of unity in an increasingly divided political landscape. Perhaps most significantly, Marcus had become a sought-after speaker at police academies across the country, where he shared his story with new recruits and veteran officers alike. His message was simple but powerful. Effective policing required understanding the communities you serve, including recognition of those who had served their country in uniform. Every veteran you encounter has raised their right hand and sworn an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, Marcus would tell police trainees. They have volunteered to put their lives on the line for the freedoms that all Americans enjoy. That service doesn't make them above the law, but it does mean they deserve to be treated with the dignity and respect that their sacrifice has earned. The impact of Marcus's advocacy extended far beyond policy changes. His story had inspired a new generation of veteran activists who were working to address discrimination in housing, employment, and healthcare. Veterans organizations reported increased membership and engagement as Marcus's example showed how military training and experience could be channeled into civilian leadership. Marcus's own life had been transformed as well. He had transitioned from security consulting to full-time advocacy, leading an organization that employed dozens of staff members and had an annual budget of over $3 million. Major corporations, foundations, and individual donors had rallied to support the Veterans Justice Initiative, recognizing that Marcus's work was addressing systemic issues that affected thousands of veterans across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from his former military colleagues. At a Veterans Day ceremony in Chicago, Marcus was surprised when Colonel Hayes appeared to present him with a special commendation from the Secretary of the Army, recognizing his continued service to veterans and his country. Marcus Washington's service to America didn't end when he left active duty, Colonel Hayes said as she presented the award. His courage in the face of injustice and his dedication to reforming systems that failed our veterans represents the very best of military values applied to civilian leadership. As Marcus accepted the commendation, he thought about that October evening when everything had changed. The arrest that was meant to humiliate and silence him had instead given him a platform to create meaningful change. The injustice that could have broken his spirit had instead revealed his true calling. The war hero had indeed become a different kind of warrior, fighting battles that were just as important as any he had faced in Afghanistan, and winning them with the same courage, determination, and strategic thinking that had made him a decorated soldier. Today, 3 years after that October evening in Chicago, Marcus Washington's influence extends far beyond what anyone could have imagined when he was first arrested for the crime of walking while black in his own neighborhood. The Veterans Justice Initiative has become a national model for advocacy organizations, and Marcus himself has been recognized as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people for his work in criminal justice reform. The statistics tell part of the story. Since the implementation of Marcus's training programs, complaints against police departments for veteran mistreatment have decreased by 73% in participating jurisdictions. More than 15,000 police officers have completed the veterans awareness training that Marcus developed, and feedback from both law enforcement and veteran communities has been overwhelmingly positive. But numbers only capture part of Marcus's legacy. His story has fundamentally changed how America thinks about the intersection of military service, racial justice, and law enforcement accountability. Veterans who once suffered discrimination in silence now have an advocate who understands their experience and has the credibility to demand change. Marcus's approach has been particularly effective because he refuses to demonize law enforcement while still holding officers accountable for their actions. Most police officers are good people trying to do a difficult job, Marcus often says in his speeches, but good intentions aren't enough when the systems and training are flawed. We have to do better. This balanced perspective has allowed Marcus to build coalitions that bridge traditional divides. Conservative veterans organizations and progressive civil rights groups have found common ground in supporting his initiatives. Police chiefs and community activists have worked together on reforms that neither group could have achieved alone. The personal transformation has been just as remarkable as the policy changes. Marcus has become a powerful public speaker, a skilled negotiator, and a strategic thinker who can navigate complex political landscapes with the same precision he once applied to military operations. He has written a best-selling memoir, Walking While Black, a veteran's journey from combat to civil rights, which has been used in college courses and police training programs across the country. But perhaps Marcus's greatest achievement is the way he has reframed the conversation about what it means to serve your country. Military service, he argues, doesn't end with discharge from active duty. It continues through civic engagement, community leadership, and the ongoing work of making America live up to its founding ideals. I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, Marcus said in a recent interview. Systemic racism and police misconduct are domestic enemies of constitutional rights. Fighting them is just another form of military service. This philosophy has inspired hundreds of other veterans to become advocates for social justice, using their military training and experience to tackle civilian challenges. The Veterans Justice Initiative now has chapters in 32 states, each led by veterans who have been trained in Marcus's methods of community organizing and policy advocacy. Marcus's story has also become a powerful tool for recruiting diverse candidates into military service. Young people of color who might have been skeptical about serving their country now see examples of veterans who have used their military experience to create positive change in civilian life. The broader impact extends to how all Americans think about justice, service, and the ongoing work of creating a more perfect union. Marcus Washington's story didn't end with his vindication or his advocacy success. It continues every day through the work of ordinary Americans who have been inspired to create change in their own communities. The Veterans Justice Initiative continues to grow, but its success depends on continued support from people who believe that military service deserves respect and that civil rights are worth defending. If you're a veteran who has experienced discrimination or unfair treatment, know that you're not alone and that there are resources available to help. The Veterans Justice Initiative maintains a hotline for veterans facing legal challenges and provides referrals to attorneys who specialize in veterans' rights cases. If you're not a veteran but want to support those who have served, there are concrete ways to make a difference. Contact your representatives in Congress and ask them to support the Veterans Dignity Act, which is still working its way through the legislative process. Support businesses that are owned by veterans, especially veterans of color who face additional barriers to entrepreneurship. Most importantly, examine your own assumptions and biases. Marcus Washington was a decorated hero whose appearance made some people see him as a threat. How many other veterans, how many other Americans are being judged by their appearance rather than their character and contributions? The changes that Marcus has achieved didn't happen because of one person's heroism. They happened because thousands of people decided to get involved, to speak up, and to demand better from their institutions. Change happens when ordinary citizens decide that injustice is unacceptable and take action to address it. Marcus Washington served his country in Afghanistan, risking his life to protect American values and freedoms. When he returned home and faced discrimination, he could have stayed quiet, accepted a settlement, and moved on with his life. Instead, he chose to fight for change, using his platform to ensure that other veterans wouldn't face the same injustices. That choice transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a movement for national reform. It turned one man's bad night into better training for thousands of police officers. It converted individual suffering into systemic change that will benefit generations of veterans to come. The question now is, what will you do with Marcus Washington's example? How will you use your own platform, however large or small, to create the change you want to see in the world? Want to see in the world? Want to see in the world? Want to see in the world?